Welcome to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. This podcast is all about conversations about healing and rising from the ashes of your grief and trauma. In this podcast, we will be deconstructing and highlighting the different aspects of grief and loss. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Zampatella. This is Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. I want to thank you very much for joining us today for our podcast. Today we're going to be talking about immigration and culture and grief. I have Dr. Michele Turley here with me, who is a really dear friend of mine and also my business partner at our other practice, Integrative Psychology Group. So the good thing about your podcast, you could say whatever you want, so plug our business. All right. So the very first thing I like to do with my viewers and listeners is just to ask you to kind of give a little bit of background about who you are, what you do, and your kind of educational background, and then we can get into the topic of culture, immigration, and grief.
Okay, well, I am a clinical psychologist. Started out my career being a teacher, then a school psychologist, and I never really knew what I wanted to do when I finally grew up. So I've kind of melded together a role for myself with clinical psychology and neuropsychology.
So say a little bit about what your practice, like what you're doing in your practice now. Do you have a specialty? Are you?
Well, I've done a lot of work with children and diagnosing learning disabilities, working with kids with ADHD, and adults with long-term illness.
And I know that chronic illness is also like a specialty,
Right.
like a subspecialty of yours too, which is a whole nother topic I'm going to bring you back for.
Okay.
Little do you know, in a future future podcast. All right. So I know that you're an immigrant, and you're an immigrant originally from South Africa.
That's correct.
And I wonder if you might be able to tell us a little bit about your story of immigration to the United States, which had lots of stopping points along the way.
Yes. Well, it's hard to summarize. I guess that's there's so much I could describe to you. So I'll give you the bare bones first, and we can kind of go from there. I was actually an exchange student to the U.S. when I was in high school, just for 1 year, and then I went back to South Africa and did my undergrad in South Africa, the University of Cape Town. I grew up in Cape Town, which is a beautiful city. And when I was 26, I was married at the time, and my husband and I decided to immigrate. He had relatives in New York City, Long Island, actually. And the two of us were going to live with them for a while. And with most immigration stories, it just doesn't go according to plan exactly. So I came ahead. My husband didn't have papers, didn't have a visa to enter the country for 5 years, it turned out. Of course, I didn't know that at the time, but yeah.
So you lived in the United States for 5 years without your
Correct.
husband, who was in South Africa.
Well, he actually went to Canada.
So he went to Canada.
In the interim.
Okay.
But, for people who know about the whole immigration process, there's points along the way where you can't leave the country when you're in a certain status, et cetera. So we didn't see each other for 5 years.
At all?
No.
Wow. So single and married at the same time?
Correct.
Oof.
Very confusing.
That sounds awful. All right, go ahead.
And then once I had a green card, and he had a green card, and then we had a daughter, and I spent a little time in Canada with him, and then ultimately we moved to Seattle. And why Seattle? I don't know. We took a big map, a National Geographic map, and put it on the living room floor, and just said, you know what? Want to be near mountains and water, and there you go.
There's a lot of water in Seattle.
This is true.
More than I think that you wanted, if I remember your story correctly.
Yeah. And Cape Town is a place where there's a lot of mountains and beaches, and so I think maybe we were trying to replicate something.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And then where from there?
And then I became a school psychologist. And I did that for 15 years
In Washington.
in Seattle, correct, yeah. I raised my daughter there and went back to school, as you know, and then moved back to the East Coast, which in some ways has a nice resonance for me because the Atlantic Ocean hits Africa. So
That's the linking object we got? Oh, okay,
yeah.
I got it.
Yeah, so that's the basic outline of the story.
I know that I'm impressed because I know that that's the short version of that, and I'm really impressed you were able to get it down into such a concise story because I think what you and I have talked about in the past is that while we might be able to get the story real short like that, it's a really long story.
Correct.
Because there's so many details and aspects of immigration that people just aren't even aware of.
Correct.
And not only what the process is like, but also how grief is woven in to that entire process.
Right.
So when you think about what it was like, I mean, each place you could probably mention what the grief was like to leave each place, but let's start, leaving from South Africa. The culture, I imagine, it must have been a culture shock to come to the United States.
Yes, it was. But even before that, it was a trauma,
Talk about that.
For my particular situation, I left very quickly. I knew I had a visa. I was never going to get another visa because the staff at the consulate made that quite clear. It was a time when the relationships between the U.S. and South Africa were not very good. So I literally packed 2 suitcases and walked out the house. Didn't pack up anything, didn't say goodbye to anybody. I had talked to my parents and my husband's parents, but other than that, I just got in the car, drove to the airport, and left.
Oh my God, what was that like?
Well, I think with traumatic experiences, you either remember every single little detail or you don't remember anything at all. And I remember going to the airport, and then I don't remember much else after that.
Wow.
I remember like the next day and the next week, and but
that airplane ride, that taking off point.
No, I mean I can conjure up what I
Sure.
think, but to be really honest, and actually after I landed in New York and I stayed with the relatives, I don't. This is what trauma can do. I'm talking to the expert, but I did not. It's hard to even believe this, but it's really true. I did not think about South Africa for another year.
At all?
No.
So you just compartmentalized it?
Compartmentalized, just dissociated it, that whole, my life before and my life then.
Why?
Well, partly, we're talking about 1987, right? There's no internet. Phone calls were $1 a minute, and I didn't have money, not that kind of, and even when I did talk on the phone, there were 2, like Christmas and my birthday, were the punctuation marks that broke up that blank year. My grandmother, when I spoke to her, when she got a call in an international call, that meant that something terrible had happened, So I was really anxious on the phone, wanted to get off the phone really quickly. And I'm thinking, well, I saved my dollars to talk, but anyway. So, and then it was busy. There was a lot. I had to find a job. I had to find a place to live, all of that kind of thing. So I kind of just hyper-focused on that, I think.
How do you navigate, how different is the culture between South Africa and New York, and how do you navigate such jarring changes?
Well, when I was thinking about this, knowing that I was going to come and talk to you about it, you leave everything that's familiar behind, and it's hard to explain it. For example, everything's different. The light switches go the other way, because I was in the southern hemisphere, now I'm in the northern hemisphere. The water goes down the drain a different way, the opposite way. I forget which is which. You drive on a different side of the road, get on the different side of the car. Everything. There's just so many little details that are so different. sometimes you get absorbed with the little nitty-gritty things like that. And then other times the things that are maybe sort of bigger, that are confusing, that you're ignorant about, those are more difficult to navigate. The little things are like, oh, wow, okay, again, I turned the light switch the wrong way, or again, I went to the wrong side of the car. But
Do you feel like you were able, let's say, okay, so you get through that first year of just kind of like,
bewilderment.
yeah, well, yeah, okay, good word for it. At what point do you feel, or do you feel, that you were starting to think about all the things that were grief related and loss related?
That's a very good question, because I think I didn't for a very long time.
Until like right now. Okay, great.
I think as time went by, the things that you lose start to kind of sink in. For example, being in a social situation, nobody can really relate to my background. So there's the me that was before and the me that's now. And I had to change my behavior to fit in. Wow. So on the one hand, there's the emotion I'm feeling, and then there's the emotion I'm projecting, or the behavior I'm projecting, because I'm trying to, it's almost like putting on a show at first, at first, and you don't feel quite yourself. And then over time it gets easier.
So it's kind of like having one foot in one culture, another foot in another culture, but not having the ability to blend them yet.
There's that, yes, and being socialized in one culture, but now you're actually living in another, and it doesn't fit.
How didn't it fit?
Well, the whole educational system is different. The whole, the way, especially back then, the way the genders interacted. For example, I wasn't allowed to have a bank account of my own in South Africa as a young adult. Things like that. My husband would order my food for me in the restaurant. It just, it just kind of wasn't something we even thought about. It just takes time for things to become familiar, and then, then there's this sort of phase where, do I like the new way? Some things are wonderful and exciting, and it's a huge opportunity. But that again is also sort of a dissonance, because I'm supposed to be so super excited. I mean, I have had opportunities here that I would never have had otherwise. And there are so many new and exciting things to do and see. And then there's that other part that, feeling like a bit of a traitor for having left.
A traitor?
I mean, well,
yeah.
Why? Is that your question?
Why? I was going to say, what about sure, why, or what about the process made you feel like a traitor? Like, what was traitorous? Is that a word?
I left.
So you feel like you abandoned them?
Well, they told me I did, It was distances were much more extreme, and because it just feel with the internet and FaceTime and whatever, it just doesn't feel the same anymore. But at that point in time, it was sort of like, going to the depths of Alaska and you were lost and gone.
So out of sight, out of mind a little bit. And so how did that impact your relationships with people back in South Africa?
Well, it was very difficult. We would write letters, mail letters that would take 2 weeks to get there. Wow. And then, a reply would take 2 weeks to get back. And I'm not that old, right? So, but, but that's the way it was, that's the way it was. I've only been back one time. So my sister now lives in Australia, so I've seen her more times. But going back is difficult, because then you do it all over again.
What do you mean?
You leave again,
So the same feelings of like being a traitor come back up, or loss, or?
It's just the enormity of it.
The enormity of it.
I don't think I consciously thought of loss. I don't think I probably consciously thought of being a traitor, but it's like I left my team, if you will. And
like your clan.
Right. it just feels big. Feels like a
Big.
big thing. A
Big
big, all-encompassing event. And I think, if I were to use a little psychological jargon, you have to redefine yourself. You have to learn how to behave in a different social setting. You have to learn how to fit in. And you have to change.
What if you don't want to?
Well, yeah, it's certain things. There are certain things that you don't want to do differently, or,
Like what?
oh gosh, I knew you were going to ask me that. Um, I've been here 37 years now. Now you're asking me a difficult question because I put all that to bed.
Well, I'm here to like rip open the wound for you.
Yeah,
So
thank you. Things I wouldn't like to. Well, I mean, they're silly, what seem silly little things, but for example, I'd never worn heavy clothing. I lived in a warm climate. Now, so those are kind of things that anybody moving from different areas in the U.S., would have the same experience. But no, I don't want to have to scrape ice off my windshield, things like that, because it felt foreign. It was a foreign experience, I guess, to do that.
I think if I think about cultures, I was just talking about how like one foot in one culture, another foot in another culture, and then if you're going through what they call the acculturation process, and I know it's kind of psychobabble, but it's the process of like getting your cultures to merge. Sometimes people will reject their old culture, and then over time, though, some people might figure out a way how to merge those two cultures, right?
Right.
And it must have, I imagine, have been, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it must have been difficult to, you speak English, so, I didn't even know. What's the problem? How different could it have been?
Well, it is because of that, it's a very private experience. You go to a party, socialize, everyone, everything's normal. But I'm the one that knows that I feel out of place.
What does it feel like? They'll have to get you the feelings chart. I'll get you the feelings chart. What does it feel like?
It feels like you're not yours, that there's a part, it's depersonalized in a way, but then again, that.
What does that mean?
It's not really me that's sitting here. I'm just sitting here, and there's this other part of me that's in my memory, in the shadows. These people don't know me because they don't know my history. They don't know. There isn't the camaraderie and the same symbiosis that I took for granted before. And that all changes over time, because the longer you're in a new environment, the more integrated you are with life and work and kids and school,
right,
and all that kind of thing. But it comes up in lots of little different ways. Like, I have a daughter. She's an American kid. She really does.
She's first generation. That's what they call children of people who have immigrated, right?
So one of the losses is sharing my heritage with her. It's not meaningful to her. Not really. Certain things maybe, but not really.
Yeah,
not really.
She's American.
She's American.
Kind of like
and
that.
She's comfortable.
I wonder, and this just popped into my head, the history of the United States and how that has always been part of my life. 4th of July is 4th of July. And I imagine, it's not like you came over here when you were 3. There has to be a part, well, no, not has to, but I imagine that there is this aspect of not having a shared cultural history up until that point in your life. Would you say that that's accurate?
Well, absolutely. But then even the things that you would think are shared, like Christmas. Well, Christmas was the hottest time of the year, not the coldest time of the year. So, it's, you lose. Not entirely, though. That's the thing. The loss is also, you process it over time, so you retain some of the things some of the customs, some of the rituals that you want to, and integrate them.
do you think that that's an important thing for
That,
people to know, to help with if they are immigrating, to try to find ways of bringing in their cultural rituals?
Yes, and also I wouldn't want to put someone on the spot and say, oh, because there's a readiness factor. You need to be ready to, because I think while it's a lonely, private experience, there's also a holding on to it. When if I share it, then it's not going to be mine, secret, my comfort.
Your comfort.
Whatever.
I'm going to tell a funny story that I tell everybody, and you know exactly where I'm going with this. All right. So when Michele and I became business partners, within probably the first year, you give somebody a birthday present and you're going to stand there and you're going to watch them open up that birthday present, because that's what you do. You're just excited, and you want to see your face. And I just had my my 50th birthday, and everybody who brought gifts just stood there and watched me open them. And I remember when I brought the gifts, I brought Michelle's gift, she just looked at me like, what? I'm like, are you gonna open it? And she's like, what do you mean am I gonna open it? I'm like, are you gonna open up the gift? And she's looking at me like, this isn't normal. Like, and mind you, this was like 6 years ago. Right? So this is still like a cultural difference. And eventually she opened it because I won. And they were very pretty earrings, I think. Anyway, but it is a story. I mean, we still tell about, just these little things that change, like even like the way we see time and the way that we open up gifts, and just these little moments that pop up even to this day,
right?
Because that's what was ingrained for you. So because the podcast obviously is a focus on grief and talking about those things that are the feelings and the thoughts and the adjustments that come with trying to make meaning from the losses that we have, how would you describe, you said trauma, and grief's always in trauma. Would you describe any part of this as being grief? Because you didn't just come to New York. Then you go to Canada, which has its own culture, and back to the United States on the West Coast, which that has its own culture that you and I talk about a lot, because I went out there for 12 years. And then all the way back here to beautiful Delaware, which has its own charm. We'll call it charm. I'm just wondering, like, are you able to identify any part of that that's grief related?
When you say any part of the journey?
Yeah.
Okay. The biggest grief is the things about South Africa that I would not want to. There's certain things you want to give up, you want to not have a part of, because the political situation, et cetera, et cetera. But there's something special about Africa, the ambiance, the color, the music, that does not translate, that I have not found elsewhere. So I think it's Africa. I can go to Canada easily. South Africa is a long flight, and very, and expensive, and it's an emotional journey that sometimes I don't know that I would have the energy for again, to be honest.
What about it is emotional for you?
What about it? It all is. It's just, what part of it is emotional? What part of the thinking about it? I don't even know if I could pick out parts of it.
It's almost like it's just like this
all-encompassing,
like a word we would call like gestalt. It's like the whole picture of it has its own.
I think the grief piece is when you immigrate, the part that is different about immigrating versus just moving to another city is the immigration is by definition permanent. I mean, that you expect, most people who immigrate, the expectation is you're not going back, and you're not going to live that lifestyle again, and you're not going to be in that social circle again, and you're not going to have that ease of understanding all the nuances of the life, lifestyle, you know. So I think it's the finality, and I think that's the resistance to going back, because I've compartmentalized it. I've also, of course, been to therapy. I've also found ways to integrate, you know, the different experiences I've had, childhood experiences, you know, with my new life, I guess. But it's making a decision to turn your back on everything you know, everything that's familiar. I don't know how I had the courage to do it, to be honest.
No, it's amazing.
I just don't know how.
Well, I mean, I've known you a while enough to know you've got a lot of courage, but to jump on a plane with 2 suitcases and being like, peace out, I'm heading out here, and just to, I mean, that required a certain amount of very courageous impulsivity. Can we put those 2 words together?
Innocent misguidedness or something.
I have a question for you, and this is, I think people associate Africa with the people there being black. And I wonder if you've run into people who look at you and go, you're from South Africa? You know, you're white.
Yeah, that happens.
Does that happen?
That's happened. That has happened a number of times. Probably less now that there's the internet and there's more knowledge about South Africa than there was, you know, when I first immigrated. But there's also silly little things that people will say, like, oh, you know, I have an uncle in Nairobi. I wonder if you know him. His name is such and such. I was like, do you know how far away that is?
No, clearly. Did you go to the pyramids a lot? No.
So people say a lot of things like that. Or weren't you scared of the lions and tigers? Well, first of all, there aren't tigers, and second of all, no, they were in the zoo. You know,
they had zoos.
Yes, exactly.
And there was a lot of political
turmoil
there, and was that part of? I think you mentioned a little bit earlier. There was part of that was actually like, yeah, I wanted to leave behind because it was just so, you know, painful. What was it like to watch the political changes in South Africa from the United States?
Well, when I left, nobody expected that the events would evolve the way they did. I did vote in Seattle at the consulate, so that was meaningful. I wasn't an American citizen yet at that time, so that was meaningful. It was exciting, you know. It was exciting, relieving in some ways, because the uncertainty of living in that turmoil was hard on people, and you know, hard on the people that I left behind. But
what would you say are some of the ways in which you have grown as a result of your immigration?
Well, I hopefully have grown up finally. I chose a difficult way to do it.
I don't know that growing up is ever an easy way, but yeah, this certainly was a
baptism of fire.
Yeah.
I just I listen to people's stories with a closer ear. Knowing that things are not always the way they seem or the way they're presented. And you know from the work that you do that everybody has some loss or some story, and that we don't always understand why someone has a particular reaction or a strong reaction, or, you know. And homesickness, if I would use that word, to me is bereavement.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
So.
Do you feel homesick often?
Not anymore.
That's
well, when the weather's like this, then yes. I would love to be on the beach right now. No, I mean, I have been here 36 years. I've been here longer than I lived there.
Mm-hmm.
So time frame, when I reached that time frame, I felt different.
In what way?
Um, I think I gave myself permission to, well, I've done my time. I've lived here as long as I lived there, so now I can choose,
Oh, wow. What do you mean now I can choose?
um, which side to identify, which side of myself to be at ease with, I think I would say.
Okay.
But that's also a little contradictory because I think part of the healing, part of the working through the bereavement is you kind of need to consolidate the different parts of yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll try to give you a little example. My grandmother lived with us for many years when I was young. And she did the cooking in the house, and she would make these crumpets, usually on a rainy afternoon, because there's a strong British influence in South Africa. British crumpets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I was close to my grandmother, so I think of that, and I'm nostalgic about that. So I make them, and they're kind of just like pancakes, a different texture, but they kind of look like pancakes. So if I make them for my family now, they call them the South African pancakes. Well, first of all, they're not pancakes.
They're not even pancakes.
They're not South African.
They're not South African.
But never mind. Because one of the cultural values of South Africa is very hospitable in terms of entertaining and welcoming people into your home and feeding them. So when I make the South African pancakes for my family, I think of my grandmother, and I enjoy making them from scratch, Although that was another expression I never understood when I first got here, was making from scratch, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But
it's like
homemade.
Homemade. Oh, okay, gotcha.
Homemade.
Oh, that must have been a change too for you, right? Was the not the sayings, but what's that word? Oh, there's a word for this.
Oh, just the colloquialism.
Yeah,
phrases
yeah,
or
sure,
whatever.
yeah.
There's lots.
There are lots.
Yeah, there are lots. But so that's an example where I feel I've incorporated some value of my values into my life here. That's just one little example. But so I now enjoy, instead of wishing I could still do something the old way, mm-hmm. I enjoy doing it this new way because I enjoy making my family and pancakes.
When you think of, the grieving process, and I'll say this until forever, mm-hmm. there are no 5 stages of grief, but there is an attempt, I think, naturally, and we naturally unfold into mm-hmm. being able to integrate loss into mm-hmm. the narrative of our lives, mm-hmm. right? So you go from like this really intense, acute grieving process to kind of like this in-between mm-hmm. process of you're not quite acutely grieving anymore, but you haven't really become the person that you're becoming with like this, whatever a new normal looks like. Mm-hmm. And then that integration process, mm-hmm. These bittersweet memories that you're mm-hmm. talking about become part of that, right? Mm-hmm. Realigning your life goals, mm-hmm. Which mm-hmm. might have looked one way when you were younger and you had yourself these futures you thought you were going to have.
Right.
And so those future possibilities you were telling yourself growing up were done. Mm-hmm. And you had to reestablish these like future identities, future mm-hmm. goals, right? Mm-hmm. And then trying to figure out what kind of relationship do you have with South Africa. Like when you lose somebody, you no longer have the person in front of you, but you change the way that your relationship is with that person. Mm-hmm. Like what's the continued bond with the person? So I imagine you do that as well when right. That's what we're kind of talking about here.
Yeah, although it was complicated because when I did emigrate here, it certainly wasn't. I didn't tell anyone I was from South Africa because of the political situation.
Okay. And we're talking about apartheid, right?
Apartheid, okay. Correct. It was sort of at the height of apartheid. There were sanctions against South Africa. The United States had economic sanctions against South Africa. People weren't welcoming of the South African situation as it was at that time. Which I understood. but so I wanted to disidentify from all of that, and did. And I think that might have been part of the blocking it out the first year as well, in addition to the just suspending all my emotional resources.
Sure.
And then, of course, it became more fashionable to say you were from South Africa after the government changed, and Nelson Mandela was a household name and all of that. So, well, now people are super interested again after.
Wow. So you go from being like, I'm going to hide this to now people are really interested. Did you find yourself wanting to talk about it more?
No,
Oh, that changed nothing. Okay.
I still don't want to talk about it.
No.
No. Over time, it became easier then again because there wasn't quite the same stigma anymore, and there wasn't the, my expectation that people would be suspicious or judgmental or whatever, lump me in with, I guess you're just, I didn't want to be associated with the apartheid government in any way. Didn't want people to make that assumption. So, but this is just sort of interesting how, life goes on, the world changes, countries evolve, people change,
Do you think, and I mean, this might be a little bit more conjecture, so if it's not something you feel like you can speak to, like totally get it. But do you think that people from cultures that have like different languages, or you can tell visually that they're from a different culture than the United States, do you think that their immigration process would have additional complications that maybe you did not experience?
Or vice versa. I mean, I wouldn't want to speak to somebody else's experience because I think my sort of takeaway message to anybody would be, it's so personal, it's so individual. But a lot of times I could hide that I was a foreigner.
Right. That's what I mean, I guess, I think where I was headed.
But when you bring up language, that sort of brings up another aspect is I did speak English coming into this. I think that made it a lot easier. But nonetheless, I do miss the way language was played with in South Africa because there are 11 official languages, and so we would do...
There's 11 official languages in South Africa?
Right.
Wow.
So I don't speak all of them, of course. But part of the vernacular is just mixing things up and just taking words from an African word from a Zulu word or Afrikaans word or anything, So sometimes I still want to use those words.
I want you to use those words. I want to hear them.
Yeah, my daughter makes fun of
does
me
she?
when I do. Yeah.
I mean, I do see that when I hear other cultures, like even when it's sound weird, but even when I get my nails done, and the person I've been working with I've been seeing her for almost 8 years, and I can hear her when she's on the phone, like real quick, like she's mixing English and kind of going back and forth, and I'll catch a word and I'll be like, I know you were talking about blah blah, and she's like, no, I was not talking. I just brought the English word in, and it's an interesting like blending, and you know what I mean, of the cultures. Because
some words are not translatable, and I think some experiences are not translatable. So to get back to the loss, there's some things that I have just accepted as that was a loss. I can't do that or experience that.
So you accept the reality of the loss,
right?
Which is another part of integrating of loss. Okay.
And then there's some things that I fiercely held on to because I'm going to do this somehow. I'm going to make this part of my life somehow. And so, yeah.
Wow. What now, as we're kind of wrapping up for the day, and one thing I really like to do at the end of all of my podcasts is to talk about what might be 3 takeaways for anybody who is experiencing losses associated with immigration, knows somebody that is immigrated and what they can do to support, like anybody who might be touched by immigration and these cultural shifts that have to happen.
I would hope that anyone listening to our conversation would realize that it is an overwhelming experience for the person who's going through it, especially those initial first few years. They just need support, whatever that means, and it's very welcome. So I don't know, taking over a casserole to somebody or whatever is just like you would when somebody passes away, right? It's very comforting. Words, not so much, because then now I have to put into words what I'm going through. I can't quite do that yet. But just knowing that there are people that care is hopeful, because it feels like, okay, I can develop new attachments. I can develop new friends.
So it's hope.
Hope. So just to be careful about what you ask somebody, kind of see if they're ready to talk.
Like what? When you say be careful, what would be some things you want to be careful about?
Oh, you must love it here. Well, yes, I do, but yeah, not everything.
This is such great opportunity here
Yeah.
compared to your culture. This culture's got more resources. This must be a relief. And just realizing that
It's just not that simple.
It's not that simple.
Right. Just be careful. I would want people to be careful about any general comments they make about immigrants in general, because it's not always true. The kinds of comments or assumptions that get made. Just a sense to bring a sensitivity, and so we should, to anyone and anybody's story, just a little more dramatic to have decided, well, I'm going to change everything. I'm going to change my family, change the climate and the culture and all those identities.
There's just so much controversy around immigration right now in our culture. Well, there always has been. If you look at our history,
Right.
I mean, I'm mostly Italian, but I'm English and Irish too. And things haven't always been pretty for
Right.
Italians and Irish. Like,
Right.
it was really ugly for a long time, but time has changed and blah blah blah, and then that goes in the background as if it never happened, and it's like, hello. But now we have different cultures that are having their own difficulty. It just seems to be like this. We always have to have a culture that we're having a problem with. You know what I mean? It's just ridiculous. But and I was also thinking to myself, they're one of the I think it was the 4th or 5th episode of this podcast was on disenfranchised grief. And you're literally speaking directly to it. Like, don't make assumptions. Don't, assume that a person's not grieving just because they're coming from a culture that maybe was, more dangerous or didn't have as many opportunities. And so you don't recognize the loss as actually being a loss, or even thinking, oh, well, it's not a death-related loss, so you're not grieving.
I think what you're describing sort of kind of captured it. There's a minimization of what's all involved.
Absolutely.
And that makes it more difficult.
And the grieving style. Like, if you're coming from, like, I don't know what the grieving style, honestly, I don't know what is the expectation of grief and how you express grief in South Africa.
Well, there's more than one culture in South Africa, right?
So that's
it
different.
varies.
Okay.
It varies.
Like us, in the United States, the same way. A lot of subcultures within the culture. So making assumptions that their grieving style is wrong is another form of disenfranchised grief. So there's a lot of disenfranchisement that can be embedded in immigration and loss.
And to me, yes, I mean, that makes sense, the disenfranchisement and the guilt that goes with, like, I'm supposed to be having a good time. But the word I would use is sort of, it's hidden. It's masked. It's a masked.
You have to hide it. And so therefore you don't get the social support you need in order to heal, which is
eventually you do, because eventually things start to be more familiar and more new routines, new rituals, new customs that are that can be I or whomever would incorporate. So over time.
Like, I get to watch you open up all your gifts now. And I opened up my earrings the other day right in front of you, and I was
Yes,
very
you
like,
did.
look at you hanging in there.
Yeah, you did.
Well, I just thank you for sharing your story, because that's a very personal story, and I know I dug around in there quite a bit, and thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really important topic that people overlook. We definitely don't assume grief and trauma as being involved with this unless you have somebody who's coming from, like, you know, they're looking for asylum, for God's sakes, because it's been so bad. So, you know, not really seeing this as a grief-related issue. So thank you so much. And so if you have any additional questions, you know, if you're looking at this on YouTube, please feel free to list the questions underneath. I'll keep an eye out on that. And when I do the question and answer, you know, episode, you know, I certainly will be sure to address that and reach out to somebody who knows better than me. And if you have any questions and you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, please feel free to go onto the Center for Grief and Trauma Therapy's Facebook page, and I'll look on there and take a look at your comments and your questions. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in a future podcast.
Thank you for listening to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it, subscribe, and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. We want to be a resource for anyone who is experiencing loss, and this is a simple way you can help us spread the word. Check out our show description. There you'll find a link to connect with me on social media, as well as helpful articles and resources.